Ukraine's tenacity in the face of persistent adversity has been evident throughout the three-year conflict. Russia has gained some territory since February's loss of Avdiivka, but it's been costly and symbolic. In this context, Denmark's donation of all its artillery to Ukraine is noteworthy and represents a shift in European foreign policy. Examine this support and its effects on the battlefield and power balance. Denmark's conflict role. Denmark and other Western nations' support for Ukraine's sovereignty and resilience sets the ground for a major war shift. How is Denmark helping in this vital moment? Before we discuss their key contributions, let's review the events that prompted this dedication. 2 days after Avdiivka fell, the North made a bold announcement. Denmark promised Ukraine all its artillery. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen criticized Europe's arms support hesitation and highlighted available resources. This is not only about production. We have guns, ammo, and air defenses we don't need and should give Ukraine. Denmark promised vital military support and challenged other states to reconsider their positions with this announcement. To demonstrate that such a donation would not cripple its arsenal, Denmark's Ministry of Defense said it was rapidly obtaining new military capabilities to make up for unit losses. In Munich, Frederiksen underlined the need to not wait on a politically fragmented U.S. to lead Ukrainian supply. No matter what the U.S. does, Europeans must protect themselves. Europe is at war. Frederiksen's statements were the latest illustration of Denmark's geopolitical policy, which helps explain Copenhagen's artillery contribution. Denmark was one of the founding members of NATO in 1949 and controlled the Baltic's western choke points, but its security integration with Europe was weak. Denmark was the only EU member state not to participate in the common security policy until June 2022. Denmark did not participate in EU defense talks or joint military deployments. These opt-outs began with Denmark's 1992 referendum rejection of the Maastricht Treaty. The Edinburgh Agreement offered Denmark many Maastricht Treaty exclusions to ensure its EU membership. One included defense. In a second referendum the following year, Danish voters accepted these opt-outs and joined the EU. This security opt-out policy followed Denmark's Cold War history. As a NATO member, Denmark did not allow foreign forces in its country. Soviet armies outnumbered Western troops in Germany and dominated the Baltic. Denmark wanted America's nuclear umbrella, but didn't want to anger the Soviet Union. Recent history reminded Danish officials of this goal's relevance. British forces secured Lübeck in northern Germany on May 2, 1945, hours before Soviet troops arrived, just preventing the Red Army from moving into Denmark. Since the previous year, the Soviet Union had invaded Bornholm, a crucial Baltic island. Bornholm is between Sweden's southern and Poland's northern coasts in the strait. A military presence there can halt Baltic east-west mobility. In April 1946, Stalin withdrew the Red Army from Bornholm, allowing the Danes to enjoy a rare post-WWW2 break in the Iron Curtain. Stalin's move was contingent on Denmark not hosting foreign soldiers, even though it was in the West's area of influence. American and British policymakers informally agreed on this during the Cold War. Denmark reduced defense spending after the Cold War. Defense spending dropped from 2% of GDP in 1989 to 1.1% in 2015. This is changing as it integrates with European and NATO security networks and ends its quasi-neutrality stance. Denmark likewise vowed to increase defense spending to 2% by 2033, but many in the West will argue that this is too sluggish. Either way, recent Danish policy changes show that its long period of relative military neutrality is ending, and voters have approved this movement. Denmark had a simple referendum on June 1, 2022, no or yes on Denmark joining EU defense and security cooperation by eliminating the defense opt-out. Amid Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Danish people voted yes by roughly 67 to 32%. Thus, Copenhagen's military isolation from Europe ended with the referendum. Danish troops might join EU military operations and influence European defense policy. More crucially, the referendum made it simpler for the Danish military to acquire weapons and equipment, which is why Copenhagen can donate all its artillery to Ukraine. Russia stopped selling natural gas to a Danish power company after hearing the news. This did not disrupt Denmark's energy supplies, but it showed Russia's willingness to employ coercion as statecraft. Moscow's actions undoubtedly convinced Danish voters they made the right choice. Denmark signaled its security strategy shift before the invasion. PM Frederiksen suggested that negotiations were underway with the U.S. on a new bilateral defense agreement that could station American troops and military equipment on Danish soil for the first time as Russia was gathering its forces along the Ukrainian border, and an invasion seemed imminent. Danish Defense Minister Morten Bodskov said any new pact will improve American access to Europe. The deal may also allow American and Danish forces to cross-train more and make it easier for the Danes to buy new military equipment and ammunition. Denmark supplied Ukraine excessively after joining the European Defense Cooperation. It's one of the biggest donors of F-16 combat jets, sending 19 to Ukraine by 2025. Denmark's recent donation of all its weaponry to Ukraine is related to this. Caesar, Copenhagen's artillery donation, is small because it has no MLRS or towed guns. Denmark has 19 self-propelled artillery units, 15 of which are ready, according to the GFI. These are French Caesar self-propelled howitzers. The Caesar began service in 2008 and has a 600-kilometer range with 3 to 5 operators. Units typically have 36 shell magazines. NATO standard 155mm ammunition may be fired from the Caesar up to 34 kilometers and 42 kilometers with an ERFB shell. Gerard Bull, a Canadian artillery expert who constructed Saddam Hussein's Project Babylon superguns, Big Babylon and Baby Babylon, designed these rounds. In 1990, Israeli spies may have killed Bull to prevent Iraq from acquiring superguns. Shells are longer and thinner than rounds. ERFB rounds include unique midsection nubs that engage the gun's rifling and stabilize the bullet, but later rounds may not have them. ERFB rounds having a longer range than normal shells, but lower accuracy. Caesar can fire the ERFB round, which NATO does not use due to its lower accuracy. Rocket-assisted shells extend the Caesar's range to 52 kilometers. Caesars cost roughly $7.5 million each, depending on the contract. On September 1, 2021, the Czech Ministry of Defense approved the purchase of 52 Caesar howitzers for $288 million. Caesar has done well in war. Russian artillery units suffered huge losses when Ukraine received its Caesar guns, which may not be a coincidence. Its introduction appears to have corresponded with superior Ukrainian counter-battery fire. The Ukrainian gunner reportedly cost the Russians 20-40 artillery systems per day at its peak. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, the Caesar was not enough to change the tide, as the Russians dug in with the most complex defenses in Europe since WWI. Zaporizhia's initial goal, the Togmac Road intersection, was missed. 8 Caesar unit losses were confirmed on the Oryx blog in April 2024. 5 were destroyed and 3 were damaged. Denmark donated 19 Caesars alongside French gifts. Assistance from the West. France declared in January that it would deploy 78 Caesar units to Ukraine and seek 280 million euros to help with 60 of them due to the Ukrainian artillery deficit. Denmark was already transferring all of its Caesar artillery pieces to Ukraine by April 2023, but Frederiksen's Munich speech announced an alternative system. Along with Caesar units, Denmark will send 21 X-21 Cordum mortars to Ukraine. Israel designed the Cordum to shoot 81 or 120 millimeter rounds. Despite being muzzle-loaded, the 120 millimeter Cordum mortar can fire 16 rounds per minute and 4 rounds per minute sustainably. If the digital firing control fails, the Cordum can be handled and targeted manually using its backup handles and optical sights. It has an autonomous recoil mechanism. 7.2 kilometers is the Cordum's effective range. Danish Weibel MVRS 700SC muzzle velocity radar systems were installed on Cordum mortars to increase accuracy. The barrel's conditions and the mortar's round's muzzle velocity affect the accuracy of its shot. Hence, this method accounts for ambient parameters, including temperature and humidity. The MVRS 700SC helps Danish Cordum systems compensate for environmental conditions and enhance accuracy. An antenna and processor connect this radar system to the Cordum's computerized fire control system. Danes obtained the Cordum in 2019 to utilize as mobile firepower. Denmark learned from Russia's 2014 incursion in Ukraine that radar and drone surveillance made artillery vulnerable to counter-battery fire. The Danes integrated the Israeli Cordum mortar inside their Piranha 5 armored personnel vehicle to adapt. The integration allows the Cordum to fire support and retreat before the opponent spots it and retaliates. Denmark's decision to send its whole artillery battery to Ukraine is the latest example of Western powers changing thinking. The West hesitated to arm Ukraine with long-range ballistic and cruise missiles when the war began. This cautious approach changed radically in 2023 when main battle tanks, cluster bombs, Storm Shadow cruise missiles, and the crucial American ATACMS for Ukraine's HIMARS troops were provided. Despite these large commitments, Ukraine's successful use of these systems in 2022 eased concerns about escalation and shifted the focus to Western arsenal depletion. The West was unprepared for modern high-intensity conflict, where sophisticated ammunition is spent at an astonishing rate. Despite years of peace and counterterrorism, complex and vulnerable supply chains make current precision munitions production and distribution even more problematic. Yet Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen believed that aiding Ukraine was vital, even at the risk of Western stockpiles. She believes a Russian loss in Ukraine will improve Western security more than massive arsenals. Frederiksen thought her bold approach would galvanize European support for a larger collective effort, even if Denmark's artillery contribution didn't win the war. At a Munich conference, Czech defense official Jan Jiris suggested that Ukraine could buy 800,000 artillery shells from non-Western stockpiles for $1.5 billion, boosting its artillery capabilities quickly. His announcement showed a growing willingness among European nations to find new measures to defend Ukraine and sustain its counteroffensive. On March 8th, Czech President Petr Pavel declared that 18 countries had fully funded the purchase of those shells. Germany would buy 18,000 rounds for $18 million, 40% of the total. Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Canada financed it. Denmark helped procure 400,000 shells. Around the same time, the Czechs found 700,000 idle artillery shells worth $1.8 billion. Ukraine's Western allies, especially Denmark, will buy them. Ukraine's artillery and shell scarcity may end this summer when Czech-brokered ammunition arrives thanks to Europe's efforts. Delivery is expected in June. Ukraine may fire 6,000 shells per day by summer, 3 times more than presently. The daily number may reach 1,000. Now that the divided U.S. Congress has approved more aid, Ukraine's shell famine will stop. How it ends supports PM Frederiksen's idea that Europe should lead its defense. She believes that defeating Russia in Ukraine now, even if it depletes domestic military stockpiles, is better than employing those weapons in the future, a worse fight on one's doorstep. Thus, Denmark's donation of all its artillery to Ukraine will satisfy Ukraine's artillery needs and launch a new era of international assistance for a country fighting for its independence. This payment may not end the war, but it can set a precedent and inspire other nations to support it. Thanks for watching and subscribing to the Ukrainian War and worldwide political news and analysis.